It is also a time where you can't say that AI is regulated like the Wild West, with some would say a damage potential like the atomic bomb. Okay, so is this viable? There are obviously legal and ethical questions that we need to address. And luckily, we have the expert on the field with us today, Natali Helberger. She's professor of law and digital technology with a special focus on AI at the University of Amsterdam. She's also director of the AI Media Democracy Lab, also in Amsterdam. And keynote speaker here, please.
Thank you. And first thank you to Agnes and Ole and Kasper for organizing this amazing program and bringing all these people together. I was super curious coming here and I learned so much already, so thanks. With the rollout of ChatGPT, OpenAI and co. have launched maybe one of the largest societal experiments ever. What happens if a handful of technology companies make extremely powerful models to automate language available to essentially anybody on this planet who has access to the internet? David already touched upon this. I will talk about some of the legal and ethical aspects of this experiment, but let me first start why we should actually care about these legal and ethical aspects. With the large launch of large language models, generative AI, the ongoing debate on responsible AI has turned from an important topic to talk about to something that is simply vital for our democracy. Because language is what makes our democracy function. The philosopher Harari has called language the operating system of our society. And he explains that democracy is a conversation, and conversations rely on language. So when AI hacks language, it could destroy our ability to have meaningful conversations, thereby destroying democracy. And looking back at all the news reporting and the debate in the past months, we have seen more and more accounts why we do well to care. Like when the New York Times reported how the automated mass fabrication of lobby communication could unhinge the democratic process. But also the reporting, for example, from NewsGuard about content farms that automatically produce a lot of content, thereby crowding out and flooding the market for attention and crowding out real voices. Or how, when The Guardian reported ChatGPT was making up its own fake news articles to make the AI reporting more credible. Not to speak, and we touched upon this morning already, the ability for mass production of disinformation propaganda at just one prompt. If social media was the Gutenberg press, LLMs are your personal editor. There, right there in your pocket. And you can choose whether you want to have a poet, your own personal Neil Stephenson, or a news reporter or a demagogue. So yes, these are vital concerns that also touch directly upon the democratic role of the media. But Harari is wrong, at least on one point. It's not ChatGPT hacking language and hijacking democracy, but those that allow it to happen, and those that use the systems to bring down democracy. And yes, it is tempting to relegate everything that goes wrong to the AI. But the uncomfortable truth is, the responsibility not to let this happen starts with us, all of us, to do whatever is in our span of control to make generative AI actually a success story for democracy. As Emily Bell said in a recent interview, opinion piece in the Guardian, ChatGPT has no commitment to the truth. Indeed, after all, it's just a large language model trained on loads of information, but without comprehension. And it's the people that use it that either have or have not a commitment to the truth. People and companies that decide to which ends to develop and use generative AI. And it's exactly here that things can go wrong. And yesterday, the CNET example was already mentioned. and how CNET actually used automated text generation to create a range of articles. And competing outlets were super quick to criticize not only the transparency notice, but also discover several factual errors and raise doubts about how rigorous the editorial process really was, which was not helped by the inability of CNET to venture more detail on how that review and fact-checking process was actually organized. This example makes, first of all, very clear that responsibility starts with transparency and editorial oversight. It also shows that if the AI gets the fact wrong, the critics will be merciless. But the criticism was not only limited to the ambiguous transparency notice and the factual inaccuracies, but also about concerns about the motivation of CNET using automation. Several commentators observed that the pieces in question were actually very general explainers, clearly optimized for clicks and high ranking on the search algorithm, thereby drowning out existing content and quality journalism. In other words, what we use generative AI for matters, and the effects of these choices can reach far beyond one individual outlet, but affect the broader media ecology. Insofar, the CNET is illustrative of some of the key ethical legal concerns around the use of LLMs in the media, some of which we have already heard coming along in the past 2 days, like concerns about the compatibility with journalistic values, objectivity, but also accuracy, and what you do how to prevent that the hallucinations of the algorithms compromise editorial values. We also touched upon issues of editorial independence and human oversight, but also how much the devil sits in the implementation, as Cecilia already hinted yesterday at it. At what point does human babysitting the algorithm become actually too costly? Then are the issues around transparency and public accountability. We have heard already quite a bit about that, and I'll talk about later, as well as about the respect for the rights of others. And actually, Ezra made yesterday an important note about the overall impact on the media ecology and also the relationship between media companies and tech companies, which is another concern. And then I want to mention one that hasn't been mentioned so far to my knowledge, but that we seriously should think about, is the ecological footprint of these technologies. According to Wired, this ramping up of AI-related tools could lead to a 5-fold increase in computing power and carbon emissions, also something to think about. So yes, there are plenty of ethical and legal concerns, and in response, actually, we already see, and that is a good thing, a vivid debate, also and especially in the media, how to deal responsibly with these AI systems. And of course, we do not start from scratch. The topic of automation is not new. And there are already guidelines out there, like the Bayerischer Rundfunk AI ethics guidelines and the BBC machine learning guidelines, that are still providing very much needed guidance. And beginning with the guidelines from Bayerischer Rundfunk and BBC and all the others that followed, like ANP guidelines, a partnership of AI, but also more editorial statements from Wired, VentureBeat, and I'm sure there are many more out there, and please do share them, because it's really important that we pool our thinking power to get this right. And what I all agree on, and what you also said in the past 2 days, is the use of generative AI needs to take editorial values and principles as a starting point. So not only optimizing for clicks and attention, but also, and importantly, for editorial values. And there's also wide agreement, also among you here, that large language model generative AI should not be a replacement. VentureBeat called it a generative AI is a creative partner. But there are some discussions, and there is some divergence among you and the media, how far this cooperation with a creative partner should go. Wired was one of the first to publish its editorial guidelines on generative AI and was very explicit. We do not publish stories generated with AI, at least not yet. To the contrary, for example, ANP, who also published its recent guideline, is not excluding the option, provided there is human oversight and editorial check. There's also broad agreement on the importance of editorial human oversight and transparency, but again, the opinions differ here. Whether to always inform users when you use AI, like Wired seems to suggest, or on a need-to-know basis, like other guidelines suggest. And a point on which, finally, most of the guidelines so far already agree is the importance of responsible experimentation. And I think Bayerischer Rundfunk put this very nicely. Experiments are an explicit part of learning, improving products, and ethical guidelines. So about the importance of creating the safe space also to experiment and innovate. Having said so, looking at all these guidelines, the emerging guidance, which is super important, you also notice that it's very inward-looking, looking at what the media does with AI and how it could be using that responsibility. And what you do not see so much back is the fact that when the media use generative AI, they are actually part of a complex value chain. And that sometimes the realization of all these ambitions about responsible use is actually critically dependent on third parties and cooperation with third parties, including cloud and data providers or the developers of these models. So, for example, data quality. Addressing the issues of bias in training data, as well as in the process of making large language models. Try for yourself and type in Stable Diffusion picture of a top manager. Chances are that you get a picture that confirms all the existing stereotypes. And part why this is so is the quality of the training, data, and the development process. So practically, this means if equality and diversity are important editorial values for you, then using generative AI responsibly also means being aware of how the model has been trained and developed and what has been done to tackle biases and stereotyping. This information is information you need from the LLM provider to be able to know how much you can rely on the system, how responsible using the system is, and what you need to do to take countermeasures. Similar is true for the issue of respecting the rights of others. Technology, I'm getting, yes, thank you. Similar is true for, of course, data protection. The use of generative AI is only as privacy friendly as the data has been trained on. And if we do not think about this, in the worst case, we may find ourselves in a situation like users in Italy, where the Italian data protection regulator has temporarily banned the system for infringements of GDPR. And then, of course, issues around copy protection and IP law, which are also very high on the minds of artists, museums, but also the news media, to what extent the systems have been trained on the data without their permission, which is an issue that creates not only a legal headache for Midjourney and co., but the problem with the legitimacy of this training data can actually trickle down into the downstream applications and create liabilities. And if you're interested in the copyright issues, I very much recommend a primer that a colleague of mine, Joel Quintais, wrote together with Nick, which brings us to the law. Many of the concerns we just talked about in the past 2 days actually boil down to the extent generative AI and the way they are used and respect core public values and fundamental rights, right? The right to property, privacy, but also fair competition and a functioning, healthy public sphere. And traditionally, law and regulation have always a role to protect these values and to define the much needed guardrails that we need to prevent that society is actually skidding out of the bend with generative AI. And this is also why you hear in all these debates the call for regulation getting louder and louder, and the timing of this conference is eerily perfect, because tomorrow the European Parliament will actually vote on its version of the AI Act, which is an ambitious piece of regulation which will have wide effect also for non-European companies offering generative AI in Europe. It's one of the first worldwide to try to have a comprehensive set of regulation for AI. And the major goal is to promote the uptake of human-centric and trustworthy AI. So there is a very strong innovation focus on creating the conditions for responsible innovation. The AI Act has a risk-based approach, so there will be certain technologies that are simply unacceptable and will be banished, like the use of social scoring. Then there will be extensive rules providers of so-called high-risk systems, that are systems that are on a list, an annex, in areas like justice, police, law enforcement, or social security. And then there are some transparency provisions for all the rest of AI and the users of AI. The use of AI in media and journalism so far is not on a list of high risk, except the recommender systems of very large online platforms. But there are some provisions on transparency about the use of generative AI. So if you're still wondering whether users should be informed about how you use ChatGPT, users, when the act is adopted, have a right to know whether they're communicating with an AI. Probably the Parliament will vote tomorrow on a provision that it will oblige you legally to ensure that all your stuff is AI literate. And there are some general principles for using and developing foundational models. And if you look at the list of these general principles, some of them are actually already reflected in the emerging guidance we just discussed, like the importance of human oversight, transparency, diversity. So here the challenge very much will sit in the implementation. Other aspects have not yet been so much considered. For example, issues around cybersecurity and resilience against malicious attacks. Ecological sustainability will also be a point of attention. And also, and that is, I think, also very important for the media, monitoring for the long-term impact of the use of the systems for society and democracy. And the media will have, or should have, or could have a very clear and added role here in helping to monitor the impact these systems have on society. And finally, there will be rules, probably a whole battery of rules for the provider of large language models. Generative AI, or foundational AI, as the Commission calls it. Including, and these rules will have to make sure to address some of the issues around fairness and respect for the rights of others that we just talked about. For example, there probably will come an obligation that all auto-generated content must be lawful and not end up in disinformation. It will be really interesting to see how this is going to be implemented. Another suggestion is to adopt a publicly available list of IP-protected training data so that everybody who has the feeling that the system has been trained on their data has a chance actually to find out. And the overall effect of that, hopefully, will be that the use of large language models will become more responsible, more safer, also for media and journalists who want to use the system. They will add additional compliance costs for those who wish to build their own systems, like Bloomberg, for example. And probably they make the building of these models for smaller media organizations more costly. But overall, the AI Act focuses very much on the providers, the developers of these models, and not so much, as you have already seen, on the users of the models. The real rules for the users of these models are somewhere very different. They are actually here, the terms of use. Right now, the real regulation for the use of large language models and the way they're being used is happening here, in the terms of use, in the small print. So everyone wanting to use generative AI and implement this system need to agree, and you agree by using them already, to the terms of use of the developer. And unlike ethical guidelines, these terms of use are legally binding and enforceable. And they will tell you what you can do and what you cannot do with it. So who of you has already dived into the terms of use of OpenAI and Co? Good. For all of you who haven't yet, I have done so for you. I looked at the terms of use of 5 OpenAI generative AI providers, 3 proprietary, 2 open source. And I would like to share in the last minutes of my keynote some of the provisions that you might want to be aware of. First of all, what you can do and what you can't do. So there's a lot of reporting right now. All these sectors get very excited about the things they can do with generative AI, the lawyers and the justice, and the doctors, and so far they better read the terms of use first. Because, for example, if you look into the terms of use for AI, OpenAI or Anthropic, lawyers and providers of financial and legal and health advice are actually banned from using the service for these purposes. All the terms of use include some language on disinformation, and that you may not use the models to create disinformation or hate speech or language to bully people, although the details vary. Midjourney tells you don't be a jerk and leaves it up to your interpretation what that means. Others, like OpenAI, have a very, very long list of things that you can and cannot do, and also some very specific conditions, for example, also for the use in the media. For example, if you use generative AI to produce content, you may not publish content that offends others, which sounds logically, but if you consider that sometimes we have to report information that also is offensive and that is protected by freedom of expression, to also publish information that shocks or offends, this can potentially be a friction. There are also specific rules for news generation and summarization, and essentially those are labeling requirements. So, for example, you must add a disclaimer to users informing them that AI is being used and its potential limitations. And the role of AI in formulating the content is clearly disclosed in a way that no reader could possibly miss, and that a typical reader would find sufficiently easy to understand. Let's go back to the CNET transparency notice, and you immediately see why CNET is in breach with the terms of use of OpenAI. There's no talk about the limitations, and at least when I'm reading it, I don't find it particularly clearly disclosed how exactly the AI is used. And breach of the usage terms can essentially end up to being banished from using the service. Something else you want to check is the quality of training data that we just talked about. For example, in the guidelines of Biofreie Rundfunk, it says, we require solid information about their data sources from our vendors, what data was used to train the model. But what if there is no transparency? Some models provide you transparencies, like Stable Diffusion is learning the Lion model. Others don't. For OpenAI, we still don't know exactly what they're training on, probably the entire internet. We also talked about the importance of responsible experimentation, building skills, auditing large language models, and conducting critical reporting, which is also an important role of media and journalism. And there's a certain irony to the fact that all proprietary models are very restrictive when it comes to data extraction, reverse engineering, or scraping, seeing that essentially that is how they build the systems. And we see here this access to data debate all over again that we had with social media. But the fact is, if you're serious about not simply using a model that you do not fully understand, or use it to build up skills and capacity in-house, you might rather consider using open source models that have not such restrictions. So, for example, OpenAI essentially, and don't read the fine print unless you really want to, says if you want to experiment, learn how our model works, or critical auditing, or you need to ask them for permission. Whereas with open source, there's usually much more transparency about this, and you have much more control. Investing in open source deserves also a serious consideration for another reason. All the terms of the proprietary providers examined, like Midjourney, OpenAI, and Anthropic, reserve the right to stop and change the service at any time for any reasons and with any explanation to you. In other words, you're entirely dependent on the whims of these providers, which again might, for some of you, echo the situation we had with social media already. Think of the debates about the Facebook newsfeed and what happened if there were subtle changes to the newsfeed that could actually put entire businesses out of business. Only that with social media so far we have now regulation to offer some guarantees, which we still don't have for open AI and co. So if you read the terms of use of, for example, Midjourney, essentially what it says, don't get in touch. We can end and change the service anytime for any reason. And if you build your future around us, sorry, that's more or less what this text says. So again, with open source, you have some more control by being more actively involved in the building of the system. And finally, part of that dependency also manifests itself in cases things go wrong. So we talked about how when you use LLMA, you might also depend on the cooperation of technology providers in effectively, for example, addressing issues of bias or concerns about the protection of copyright. And also the AI Act acknowledges the complexity of the value chain and highlights the responsibility of the provider to also assist. But the contractual reality is very different. So essentially, if there's a problem, because you use the system, the responsibility is entirely yours. That's true, by the way, for both proprietary and open source system. Only with open source you have some more control. So, and this is also one of the areas where actually the AI Act could again be actually of practical relevance to media organizations using large models, because one of the provisions the Parliament will vote about tomorrow is a review of the contractual terms and defining some rules when they're unfair, namely if they're contrary to good faith and fair dealing or create significant imbalances. And the EC is tasked, the European Commission will be tasked to draft model guidelines. So now is also really, because of that, the time to start a discussion of what good commercial procurement practices should be. With the lab, we're doing some work of that, and I'm sure you have thought about that too. But I think it's really a discussion we have to have now. To conclude, if language is our operating system, the media are our democracy's killer applications, fueling the democratic debate and acting as critical observers. And as such, the media have always developed together with technology and defined also the rules for using that technology responsibly. And the use of generative AI is no way different here. And in the past days, we heard about many, many opportunities to use generative AI for cool new functions and services to users and experimentation. But before jumping heads-on into the generative AI adventure, it is critical to choose the rules of responsible engagement, because in the end, this is also about democracy. Some media organizations have already begun to do so, and now is the time to join them in defining the ground rules. At the same time, be aware that new rules are coming from Brussels to make safer large language models, but also to impose additional obligations. And finally, the third takeaway, responsible use of generative AI starts with responsible procurement. How do the values of a tech provider, tech company align with your own editorial values? How does your choice for a particular provider fit in your editorial vision and longer-term strategy? Do you use off-the-shelf software or invest in in-house expertise? Do you go for open source or proprietary models? How much cooperation can you expect if things go wrong? And at which point is there an unfair, uncritical division of responsibility? So, my last takeaway is mind the small print and the bigger picture. Thank you.
Thank you for an extensive overview and very important points. Now, you are standing, or actually we are all in a room with high levels of security because of something that happened in 2005, which was the cartoon crisis, or the Muhammad crisis, which I guess everybody has heard about. Otherwise, I'll tell you about it afterwards. My question would be, in your view, how literal should you take what OpenAI writes about that you cannot use it to offend somebody? Is that really something that you have to take into your mind when you use OpenAI's models?
Yeah. According to the terms of use, you may not. And I think we should have a serious discussion to what extent this conflicts with freedom of expression. The proof of the pudding will be enforcement, of course. If you use generative AI to publish content, you are in breach of the terms of use, and potentially you could be banished from using these services. The question is, will they enforce that and monitor that? And you could put some question mark to that, seeing the large-scale rollout of these systems, which also raises some questions. How responsibly can they, for example, exclude the use of generative AI for disinformation? So I think we also will see some stepping up of the monitoring efforts exactly in order to avoid legal responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. We have time for a quick question here.
Hi, I'm Filippo from Infomedia. So about a month ago, an open letter surfaced asking about stopping AI experiments on language models larger than GPT-4 for a number of months. Some people say in efforts to regulate the technology, some people may be thinking to just gain back the competitive advantage that OpenAI got. What is your opinion on it? And also, what is your opinion on the possible imbalances that the differences in laws and regulations between different countries or governments can bring to the current technological landscape?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Regarding the first, I think it's quite telling that Elon Musk only a couple of weeks later announced his own AI experiments. So that is hopefully the answer to your first question. Regarding to the differences that laws can create, I think this is a really important point, but not only between countries, but also, for example, between larger and smaller media companies using these. So, because larger media companies will have much more resources to invest in striking deals with OpenAI and co, but also doing compliance with the legal obligations, whereas smaller systems, smaller providers will probably either depend on existing systems or have a far worse negotiation position at the negotiation table. And I think this is something we need to think about.
Okay, Natali will be back in the panel later, so thank you for now at least.
Thank you. Thanks.